most of the time that I was growing up, I would just see you and your family when we would come visit Chicago over the summer, and we would go to our shared family lake house in Wisconsin because my family lived in Washington State and you were in high school living in suburban Chicago. So as we grew up, we didn't really have any type of adult relationship because we were in such different places. So I guess for me, I have a lot of gaps in like what happened to you from other than your general well-being,
Right.
from your college experience and how you decided to come to Puget Sound all the way to now. Like, what was, if you could give a synopsis of your time post high school, deciding where to go to now?
Totally.
What are you talking about?
Smoking in a bong or a blunt.
Grass.
Dang.
Reefer. Was is jobba? It just means like pasta from a joint. Ganja.
Hash.
Fucking awesome.
Hello and welcome back to Exploring Cannabis and Exercise, a podcast where the anecdotes meet the data. This week I'm excited to share a kind of different conversation between me and my cousin to get to know me a little bit more, and as my cousin says in the episode, why you should trust what she's saying and not that I'm not just some stoner in the woods. Not that stoners in the woods are bad people, but you know, I'm an academic here. So Haley and I grew up geographically really far away from each other and are also about 10 years apart in age. And so it's been really fun to get to know each other as adults. I reached out to her a few years ago when she was talking about a podcast that she made as a senior project in college. And at the time, I knew I wanted to start the podcast, but just had no interest in doing any audio editing at the time. She was so amazingly helpful in all of the steps to get the podcast off the ground. She created that mashup you'll hear at the very beginning. She helped me create the structure of how I wanted to do the episodes and gave me a lot of really helpful feedback. You'll hear us both say a lot of ums and likes and oh my gosh, now that I've taken over the audio editing aspect of things, I am hyper aware of those things, so I apologize in this episode. I took out as many of the likes and ums as it felt reasonable to do. So in this episode, you'll learn more about my academic journey and my thoughts on cannabis. We recorded this in the summer of 2022, so as I was editing, I have a few little updates. First one is that Haley and I hung out for the first time in like a decade this summer in Seattle. It was awesome to experience Seattle with her. As you'll hear, I also had some formative years in my life in Seattle, and so it was really fun to see Seattle and through a different lens and spend that time with her, and just a fun reminder that we're super duper related. We talk really similarly. We have kind of similar ways that we look at the world, even though we grew up very different lives. 2, I learned how to roll joints, and so I'm now pretty good at rolling joints. And then 3, I learned that I no longer enjoy pairing edibles with hot yoga. So I'll have another episode where I go through my own process of talking about my experiences of using cannabis with exercise. And so it's just really interesting to hear myself talk about how much I liked using edibles with yoga because it's just super not part of my routine anymore. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed this episode and learn a little bit more about who I am. And as always, hope you enjoy and make good choices out there. Welcome back to the podcast. This episode is going to be a little bit different than other episodes, where this week my cousin / producer is going to be interviewing me. So you get to learn more about who I am and why you should listen to this podcast.
Yeah, that's me. I'm Haley. I am Whitney's cousin and producer / editor / kind of brainstormer for the podcast. But I think it would be beneficial for our listeners to learn more about our host, right? And know like why we should trust what she's saying. She's just some stoner in the woods. Where's her her expertise coming from?
That's right.
So yeah, our positions are a little bit reversed because I'm going to be interviewing her And I guess maybe we could just start by giving the little rundown of how the podcast even came about and how we started working together.
Yeah, so I've had a podcast idea in my head for a really long time. I've kind of known for a long time I've wanted to do a podcast. But in your last semester in college, you made a podcast and I listened to it. And then over the years, I've just put zero effort into trying to understand how to do audio or video editing. And it was like, okay, well, Haley has done this thing already, so maybe maybe she can help me with this idea that I have. And so that's how we got started together.
Yeah. And we are cousins. We're second cousins, actually.
Your mom is my first cousin. So your grandmother is my Aunt Judy. And so we grew up in very different places as well.
Yeah. It's really funny because whenever we talk or have meetings, I just kind of fall back into a Midwestern accent.
Yay!
Because my mom is from the Chicago suburbs, and so is Whitney. And all of our family just has really the thickest accents. I don't even know if you realize how thick they are until you leave.
Oh my gosh, Amy O'Neill is like the most classic Chicago accent. I'm obsessed with it.
I love it. It feels like home.
Totally. And then when I went to college in the Pacific Northwest, like really close to where you grew up, that's when I started realizing how significant my accent was, and have slowly gone away from it. But, it just takes like being around the right people for my Chicago thing to come back.
Yeah, it's like that accent really never leaves. It's crazy. Like my mom has not lived there for so long, but she still has such a thick accent.
Oh my gosh, I love that so much.
Yeah, someone was saying the other day that I say olive. I'm like,
oh my God.
Olives. Like, I don't know.
I think for me, the first one was just college. Like I'm going to college.
Yeah. But yeah, so we most of the time that I was growing up, I would just see you and your family when we would come visit Chicago over the summer, and we would go to our shared family lake house in Wisconsin, because my family lived in Washington State and you were in high school living in suburban Chicago. So as we grew up, we didn't really have any type of adult relationship because we were in such different places. So I guess for me, I have a lot of gaps in like what happened to you from other than your general well-being,
right?
From your college experience and how you decided to come to Puget Sound all the way to now. Like, what was, if you could give a synopsis of your time post high school, deciding where to go to now?
Totally. Yeah. So I knew I wanted to go to a smaller kind of school for college, and I thought I wanted to be in the Pacific Northwest. And I remember I applied to schools across the entire United States, but Puget Sound was kind of my goal school. And I was also the first person from my high school to go to the University of Puget Sound. And so I really like the idea of getting away from Chicago and getting away from Illinois and kind of getting out of the Midwest and seeing what life was like out in the Pacific Northwest. And I just loved it. And so I decided to get my bachelor's of exercise science from the University of Puget Sound. And then I went straight from undergrad into physical therapy school. And the thing that kind of inspired me to go to physical therapy was that I was a swimmer from growing up into high school. And then I had chronic shoulder pain, and I was not really interested in swimming anymore. And so but then I ended up swimming my freshman year of college, and the chronic shoulder pain was just like not doing it for me anymore. But I knew that I wanted to do something related to swimming and like helping to have other swimmers prevent injuries. And so that brought me into an interest in physical therapy school. So I went straight from undergrad to physical therapy school at Regis University in Colorado. And so it was a Jesuit school. Doctor of Physical Therapy school is 3 years long. So I was in Colorado for 3 years. and then for the DPT school, and then went out to Seattle right after I graduated from PT school and worked out in the kind of Seattle area. And I think that was like maybe the last time I saw you was in like 2011, 2010-ish.
Oh man, yeah, I wasn't even in high school yet.
Oh my gosh. And I came
Yeah.
out for Thanksgiving, and that was the last time that I think I saw you in person, which is weird.
Yeah, wow, that was a really long time ago.
I know, like a lot of things have happened.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I lived in Seattle and worked as a physical therapist in an outpatient orthopedic clinic. And there was something about it. I'm more of an introvert than an extrovert. And so just being with people all day long was like draining for me. And so I went back to my college and talked to one of my old professors and said like, hey, I think I want to do research and I'm not really sure what to do. So she got me hooked up with my now mentor, Ted Becker, who's up in Everett, Washington. And when I met up with him, he said, I think you should go get a PhD at Indiana University. That's where I went. And so just like within the first 2 hours of knowing my mentor, he got me hooked up with who ended up being my master's thesis advisor, Joel Steger. And I ended up going to the Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, for my master's in exercise physiology. And then around that time, I decided I started talking to another one of the professors there, and he was more on the motor learning, motor control end of the spectrum, which was like a newer field. I hadn't really had much experience with that. And I just loved it. I loved our conversations, and I decided to switch over to John Shea, who was my PhD advisor, and focus more on psychology and the way that the brain and body talk to each other to create movement. And so then I got this job at Humboldt. So now I'm out here.
It's a lot of school.
It's a lot of school and a lot of student loan debt. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I like my core memory of like your posts, like us being young together is, well, like by young, you in high school, me as a child.
Totally.
But was like you just always being in school for something.
Yep. That was very much true. I like to joke sometimes that I was in graduate school for so long because I don't like the real world. It's like if I can just spend time learning more things and just like avoiding getting a job, then that would be awesome. But I will say, even though when I was back in Indiana for my master's and PhD, I decided or I still worked as a physical therapist. And so I was a physical therapist for babies in rural Indiana. So I would go to babies' homes and help them work on their gross motor skills. And so like helping babies learn how to crawl and stand and walk. And, it was a blast. And so I had a really good time with that.
Oh man, sounds really just like every day feeling like you have such purpose.
Yeah. Well, and it's like physical therapy with adults can be kind of hit or miss because we all have our like weird psychology and stuff, but like babies, you just like hold a toy like just out of reach and it's like, well, how do I get to that toy? And so it was I saw more changes and like a greater, I don't know, babies always get better, babies are always like growing and getting more interested in different things. And so just really liked working with babies.
I can imagine. Sounds really cute. Yeah, so you did come visit a couple times when you were living in Seattle. Yeah. And now I live in Seattle, which is fun because we can talk about like the neighborhoods and stuff and we know what we're talking about.
Exactly.
But I did grow up in such a rural place in Washington, and Washington is very cannabis friendly. And especially in Eastern Washington where I was from, there's just like every other field is a pot field. And
really,
yeah, especially probably more so than since when you visited, but the entire valley pretty much smells like weed.
No way.
Oh there's a bunch of dispensaries. It's really developed like in the rural areas where there's like land, probably similar to Humboldt.
That's so interesting because I I feel like one of the memories, like one of the biggest memories I have of coming out to visit you guys is your dad talking about this like major like weed bust that he caught at the border and was just like so proud of like this like massive amount of weed that was coming over the border. And
Yeah. I think it's still like that though, because it's like it's like international lines.
yeah, good point. Good point.
Not just the I mean, who knows, but I don't even know what that's like now.
Totally.
But you grew up in suburban Illinois. And so what growing up and like in high school, what was the general perception of cannabis like?
Yeah, so I didn't smoke weed in high school. That was I think that both of my parents, it was more of like an understood like you're not going to do this kind of thing. And I was also an athlete, and so we like signed a little thing that says we weren't going to, you know, drink or do drugs while we're in season and things like that. And at the same time, none of my friends smoked weed either. And so it was just like not around me ever in high school. But the perception was that the people who were smoking weed were like the bad kids, you know. It was like very much like wrong side of the tracks kind of mentality. And then so that bled over into college, where I was now in the Pacific Northwest and like way more open to weed. And during my orientation, we were on a camping trip for Puget Sound. And it was my first time actually like ever being around weed. And I remember like there's like 4 people and 3 of them were sharing this joint. And I was like, no, I'm not going to smoke weed. And I didn't until after my freshman year of college. And I went back home, and some of my friends from high school had started smoking weed when they were in college. And I remember them describing to me what it would feel like. And one of my friends said, it's kind of like that place between when you're awake and when you fall asleep. And I was like, oh, that's like that doesn't sound that bad. Like, okay, give me some of that. And and then I like, you know, would see it around college and like was fine, you know, having like a bowl be passed my way. And I was like, okay, I like know what I'm doing, but didn't really buy my own weed until the end of like my sophomore year. And so it's kind of been a slow progression. And I'm really, really happy that I didn't get into weed too early, and that like I got to enjoy my like high school time and, you know, do all that without weed in my system. And so it's been a fun process.
Yeah, that's okay. That's another potential podcast episode, honestly, like your whole thoughts on like youth and weed. That could be like a really good episode. But yeah, so that was okay. That as like a nosy younger cousin, I've always kind of wondered like when you and Jay and all of them were like smoking.
Oh my gosh. Well, and then so Jay, I don't know if you ever heard about this, but my younger brother Jay, my parents found weed in his room when he was in high school. And they sent him to Narcotics Anonymous. And,
oh my gosh, I do remember that.
Right? And so he was in Narcotics Anonymous. He got a sponsor, and the sponsor told him that he needs to find a replacement for weed. And so the sponsor told him to start smoking cigarettes.
What?
Right? And so my brother like smoked cigarettes for years.
That is insanity.
Right? Yep.
Do your parents, what did they say about that?
You know, I think.
Is it touchy?
Yeah, definitely still touchy.
Mm-hmm,
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, well, like, what would you do if you saw your kid doing drugs? And it was like, okay, I don't know.
I can imagine. Yeah, that's a really funny story. But that's kind of like what I living here imagine like a suburban Midwestern childhood to look like with weed.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's crazy, man.
Yep. Yeah. And I don't think we ever really talked about it much as a family. I feel like I don't really even know anything about like the cousins either. Like we didn't really talk about that ever.
Yeah, no, I don't think it was discussed. I would say our family, I think they're drinkers for sure.
Exactly. I was
so
like,
it was never even came up.
Right.
That was kind of the bonding thing.
For sure.
But yeah, no, that's really funny because like, yeah, my family, I don't think like growing up, I didn't really ever talk about it either. But when I went to college in Prague in the Czech Republic. And like, that was a totally different experience because everything is accessible in Prague, literally everything. Nothing is, all drugs are decriminalized. And it's also a very safe place. So it was like when you get there, there's a whole world of like anything you want is available to you. So I kind of had like the opposite experience of just being like, okay, I'll try anything like one time. And then weed just being the most enjoyable of everything, including alcohol for me, because I don't really drink very much.
Right.
I mean, I do, but I think like in comparison to like growing up in our family, like I probably don't partake as much as, I don't know,
the rest of the family. Really.
Yeah, I guess. But yeah, so what with after like you had your initial experience, you're like, okay, yeah, I enjoy cannabis. What you kind of explained a little bit about how you got into like the research side of things, but when did it really click with you that cannabis and exercise research was what the road you wanted to go down?
Yeah, so I think it's always been something that I've been tangentially interested in. In college, I was a exercise science major and friends with some rock climbers who also like smoked a lot of weed. And so I was like, there's something here. So that was kind of like the first kind of pin in my head. Then when I went to PT school, actually I was drug tested when I went to PT school. And I remember talking to your parents and like actually like all the cousins at the lake about like, hey, I have to be drug tested. Like within a month of seeing it, I was like, I need to make sure that I pass this thing before I start PT school. And like the whole family was like, all right, so here's what you should do. And yeah, I would also talk to one of my friends in PT school who used cannabis to help him recover from a brachial plexus injury, like a nerve injury to his neck that affected his arm function. And so just talking to him about the potential of using cannabis with physical therapy was really a nice addition to just like the regular programming of PT school. And then when I was like working as a physical therapist, I was also spending time working with my mentor, and he would go to trials. He's like an expert witness for injured workers to see if they can go back to a job or if they need to be on permanent disability. And I was watching him in court one day, and the opposition was trying to get him to say something about weed because one of the clients who they were fighting for in court, I guess he bought weed like the night after the test that we did on him, and they were trying to use it like against him. And I thought that was really interesting because it was like, I bet there's no research on this. And then finally, when I got to my time at Indiana, I was just really curious about it. We were spending a lot of time in the different labs that we had. And so just thinking about all these different variables and like, oh gosh, I wonder what would happen if you were high while you were doing this. And so I was always thinking about different fun research ideas, but like way too scared to try to even like test those things while I was in Indiana. But shockingly, there's like some really cool research about weed use that is from Indiana. And so it was more about like schizophrenia though, and like and the endocannabinoid system and pain. And so I remember talking to one of the professors from the psychology department there, because I was like, hey, I'm kind of interested in doing this thing. And it didn't pan out while I was at Indiana, but when I was looking for jobs, someone told me about a job posting at Humboldt State University in my domain. And I was like, Humboldt, that name rings a bell, like for me, and like, you know, buying weed in college and being like, it's from Humboldt County. And I was like, okay, I wonder if Humboldt is going to be the place where I can finally do the research I want to do. And so right when I got the job, I saw that there was the Humboldt Institute for Interdisciplinary Marijuana Research that was on campus. And And so I reached out to the two co-directors of the organization at the time, of different researchers from around campus who do, weed related research. And so it was a professor in economics and then a professor in sociology that were the two leaders of the time. And I knew I wanted to do a study about cannabis and exercise, and then ended up getting hooked up with Greg Gold, who will be another episode, but got connected with Greg Gold from psychology, and we decided to work together. So like within the first month of me getting my job at Humboldt, that's when I started doing the cannabis and exercise survey and started formatting that. So it was like, all right, got this new job, doing a new line of research, which is usually pretty risky for people to do. And it's all been uphill and in a good way since then.
Nice. Okay. So it was a lot of like very curiosity based.
For sure. Yeah.
Nice. I think the best work comes from the curiosity, like just like genuine curiosity.
Totally. Yep.
So my next question that I was curious about is, have you received any negative feedback with the research you're doing, and drug use and war on drugs, and within your personal relationships as well as professional relationships?
Before I reached out to the other people on campus related to cannabis research, I first reached out to a couple people in my department to see like, hey, can I do this thing? Like, am I going to get in trouble if I like do something, weed related? And for my department, it was more or less just, I don't know, general like disinterest, or like really like, why is this like a thing that she's looking into? And I was kind of I'm like off in my own like little desert of looking at weed. And so it was really nice for me to have colleagues from other departments around campus who could talk about cannabis use in just different ways. And so helping me broaden the idea of cannabis and exercise outside of just exercise physiology, which is a lot of what I'm seeing now with the researchers in Colorado that I've talked to, who are looking at straight up exercise physiology, cellular side of exercise physiology stuff, and cannabis. And like, because I didn't have the research team and the lab space or anything to do that kind of stuff, I ended up just partnering with other people around campus. And I think that was really helpful for me. But yeah, in terms of like other negative things, I think at this point, a lot of my friends from my PhD program had already kind of known that I've been interested in weed stuff. And so they were like, oh my gosh, Whitney's like finally doing her weed stuff. And so I think that all of my friends have been really supportive. Even my PhD advisor, he and I have had really long conversations about a bunch of different ideas for research. And so I felt supported in a lot of ways. And it's also been a process of getting my parents on board with my research. And I think that because I'm looking at it from a research angle, they've been more accepting of it. And kind of like full circle now, this is, kind of off track here, but, we tend to be more of drinkers than anything else. And my brother and I will be not nice to each other when we're drinking. And my dad got really fed up with us one year because we were being mean to each other. And then Jay and I were like, listen, Dad, we don't think that like alcohol and us hanging out as a family is a good thing, but we actually get along really well when we're smoking weed together. And so can we just normalize that, please? And so we smoked a joint with my dad that night. And then since then, it's like now, I'm way more comfortable bringing edibles to like a family gathering and just like normalizing that, or like, having a joint with my brother, even if my parents are like not at all interested in weed, they're less less judgmental of us using it. And I think part of it is because I also understand how it works in my body and know the science behind it. So I think they like kind of trust me a little bit more with it, but who knows?
Yeah. No, I definitely can see that. Like, I think in general, I would say, more older like parents of people in like the millennial age range and even the Gen Z age range have like really just come around to it a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, and it's been wild to see all of the changes in acceptance over the last, 5 or 10 years. I think I was saying at one point, with the Sha'Carri Richardson stuff with the Olympics and like the Olympic trials where she tested positive for weed and wasn't able to compete in the Olympics. And the outcry from the public about like, no, we should let her run. We never would have heard that at like even the last Olympics before this, like that never would have been the case. And so it's really exciting to see an increase in the public acceptance of weed. So I think that I kind of came on like right as things were like starting to move in that direction, especially related to cannabis and exercise.
Yeah. So following like a follow-up question to that, or what would you say if you had to pick, one or two major things, what are the negative misconceptions around cannabis that you find the most harmful?
Yeah, I guess in terms of like harm, I think the biggest, most harmful kind of thing is just painting a broad strokes, either in either direction of cannabis is the work of the devil and like it's going to ruin your productivity. You're like never going to be the same person again. It's a drug of abuse. Like, you can still get addicted to this thing. It screws up your brain. It leads to other drug use. I think that's really harmful. But then on the other end of the spectrum, like I also think that people being like cannabis is going to solve everything is also slightly harmful, like less harmful than the other side. But I think both ends of the spectrum end up being harmful for and actually not in line with how most people have experienced weed either.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that.
One of the things that I heard a lot about is, back to the Sha'Carri Richardson thing where it was like, really, is it a performance enhancing drug? Does it really help you? Like it might help you get more potato chips to your mouth while you're like sitting on the couch. And it's like, that's like a weird overgeneralization of like what weed can be. It's like, yeah, there are certain, people and there are certain strains and stuff like that make you more lazy and like be okay with just laying on the couch. But people are also super functional with weed in their system too. And so I found that kind of joking about it, like, oh, really, it's a performance enhancing. I found that kind of frustrating as well.
I like that you say that because I had this experience when I first moved back to the States. I was visiting friends in Denver and they suggested a dispensary down the street. And I was really excited because I'd never really been to a dispensary. I'd never been to a dispensary because I hadn't lived in the States when they were becoming a thing.
Right.
And I went to it and it was definitely that specific dispensary. I don't remember the name of it, but it was very bougie. And it was like one where you like sat down with a bud tender and I was just like so caught off guard. I was like, I just want to look for like the cheapest eighth. And they were like, so what do you want to feel when you're high? Do you want to be creative? And I was like, no, I just want to be high and like go for a hike. And I just was like, the industry has gotten a little weird. Like
totally. Absolutely. Yeah. And it also went from some dispensaries being like, okay, come through this locked door. Now you're going to see a security guard come through this other locked door. And it was like, there's still some of those too, but like, it felt kind of like sketchier in those kind of places. And then, but then you get the other end of the spectrum of just like a super bougie, like it's like an Apple store, but for weed. And it's like, what am I doing here? What's happening?
Yeah, no, it's such a spectrum. And like, it was only a matter of time till capitalism got weed too, which is a whole other topic.
Oh yeah, exactly. Here. I know, honestly. The other thing about dispensaries that in terms of like misconceptions and stuff is something that bothers me is when I see products that are specifically like, it's like, this is going to increase your focus or like, this is going to improve your sleep or your concentration. I don't know. It's like these things that are marketed to serve a certain purpose. And I think like, all right, how did they do that study? Like, did they do a reaction time study? Like, which test did they use to see that this improved concentration? Like, they probably didn't. And that's the part that drives me so crazy, is that a lot of the marketing is just flying however they want to right now. So,
and that scenario is kind of why this podcast is great, or like why we need this podcast, because there's like, people don't think about those kinds of things.
Exactly. It's just like, oh yeah, sure, this percent of THC and CBD leads to increased focus. And it's like, we actually don't have research on that. That's not supported at all in the research.
So what would be your statement that you say to critics of cannabis use with exercise, whether that be, the NCAA or, whatever it is?
Yeah. Well, I think that people use cannabis for a variety of reasons. And so like when I think about sport regulation, when I think about high school, or like maybe not high school, because like I still kind of feel like, be a kid while you still can. You can get into like drugs and alcohol later. But in college, there's so much pressure on student athletes, and there's been an increase in suicide risk in college athletes as well. And so it's really interesting how they're okay with alcohol, which is, pretty not great for mental health. So damaging. And then there's absolutely zero tolerance on weed. And it's like, these people are like dealing with major stuff, like if you get injured when you're in college and you can't do your sport anymore, that you've worked your whole life to get to this point, and to have that gone is devastating. And so I see like a mental health benefit. I always kind of see weed as a part of a bigger collection of things, rather than like student athletes should all smoke weed. It's like, no, for the students who do find relief from that, if it helps them to be able to tolerate walking again after an injury, or if it helps them just kind of chill out at the end of the day, like I wish that we would be more okay with that use of it. And I remember talking to a PhD friend of mine, and because I'm kind of more focused on how does weed affect someone's actual performance during an activity. And he's like, high level athletes are not going to get high and do their sport. They're not going to compete high. I mean, some people, there have been some like football players who are like, oh yeah, like I've gone to a couple of games high, but high level athletes are probably not going to get high before they go to a competition. And so but the problem with weed is that it stays in your system for up to a month. And so like you can still test positive for weed, a while after you actually used it. And so the problem with that is that you don't know when an athlete tests positive for weed, that you don't know if they used it like a week ago in a performance enhancing kind of way, or if they just like had it with some of their friends over the weekend in like a non, like just outside of their, the realm of them as an athlete. And so I'm encouraged to see the changes in sport policy from Major League Baseball, and like NFL is kind of like slowly tiptoeing, getting closer and closer to being okay with it. And so I'm encouraged by all of that. And I think that it's taken a lot of athletes to open up that conversation, really high level athletes to talk openly about their own use, to really start to change some of these policies.
Yeah, I think like changing the perception to like it's an individual experience versus like it's just weed. Like it's not that big of it's the same as having a drink at the end of the day, right? It's like
right.
Not this super addictive thing, maybe, but
yeah. And I think it's also, with athletes and chronic pain and stuff, a lot of them are using like opioids, and we have this opioid epidemic, and there's a lot of research to show that people are using cannabis as a substitution. So people can use like cannabis and like as a way to get off of opioids, and an opioid sparing use of cannabis. And
in a lot of athletes, like particularly football, like there's a lot of opioid use in football players. And so when we just say like, oh yeah, the prescription's got it going on, like just focus on like whatever that is, people tend to not check in as much with people to see how they're like actually doing otherwise. And so I think, regardless if someone's using an opioid, if that's what's helping them be able to tolerate exercise, whatever. And same thing with weed, is just kind of checking in with them as a human, just making sure it's not just, oh yeah, you're smoking weed as a way to kind of space out and not be present. It's like, okay, how are you using this? Is it a good addition to your life, or are you starting to withdraw? Are you showing other signs of like mental health distress? And so I think regardless of the athlete, I hope that people are starting to kind of look at the full picture.
Yeah. And I guess my last kind of serious question I have for you is, do you feel like there's and this is like my own personal question, sort of like, do you feel like there's like weed has historically had this narrative around it of like, you get really spacey and you can't do things and you just want to lay down, where if the narrative had been the opposite of like, it makes you focus more and it makes you mentally, like a different type of narrative, there would be a different perception of it now?
Interesting. Oh, that's such a cool question that I've never thought about. And I think when I've heard people talk about the history of weed, they talk about it in terms of like, oh, this is something that people have been using for centuries to help with pain. And then even like the 1800s, it was like, this is going to help with your pain. And so I think a lot of the focus has been on pain reduction rather than on like the side effects of it. So that's actually really interesting to think about. Dang. Okay, cool. I have like new research idea.
Yeah, no, think about it. Yeah, I'm asking because like I'm dyslexic and weed has like, since I was, an adult, and now I find it easier to focus on a lot of things because I don't have the voice in the back of my head saying like, try harder, kind of,
Totally. I think the same thing for me and like running, for example, or like really other exercise, when, at least for myself, like because I know so much about exercise and exercise physiology and like how the body is moving, it just makes exercise way less fun because I'm just constantly thinking about and like berating myself for not remembering certain things about exercise physiology, or just like, oh my gosh, I need to like collect data on this. Like I'm just constantly thinking about science, like while I'm running. And so I think sometimes for me, like using weed with exercise has helped me kind of calm down that voice that's in the back of my head to just be like, we're running. We're just going for a run. It's like a fun thing. You enjoy doing this. Like we don't need to turn this into a data collection time. We don't need to make a graph out of this. Like I can just enjoy it.
Yeah, I actually my next question was going to be, what are your personal exercise habits?
Yeah, so it's obviously been a little bit, it's like changed over the years and like specifically with the pandemic, but I right now mostly do rock climbing, bouldering, and then running every once in a while, and I'm finally back into hot yoga again after the pandemic.
Cool. And how often do you use cannabis while doing these things?
I would say 95 to 100% of the time. Yeah, it's just finding the right product and finding the right things that I enjoy. Some of the research that I've found and that other survey research has found is that it helps people enjoy the exercise experience. And so that's kind of how I see it, as just like not getting too in my head about being in beast mode and like, like that's not what I'm there to do. I'm there to do my body in interesting ways and get stronger in the process. And so yeah, I've kind of figured out like edibles with yoga, because it's like an hour and a half. And so, to have something that like lasts a little bit longer. And then I typically will smoke before running just because I don't run for very long. And so if I took an edible, I'd have to like do chores or something first before I actually started the run. Yeah. And with climbing, sometimes I typically like to take an edible before I go, and then it kicks in like while I'm climbing, and I can usually tell like, oh, there it is. But yeah, more just to
Nice.
enjoy it and enjoy climbing to the music and focusing on that rather than how does this feel in my body versus like I have to get to the top of this route.
Yeah, like maybe it makes your exercise more thoughtful and
Yeah,
like with purpose.
totally.
Cool.
Yeah.
I like that. So you want to go into a little bit about what our catchphrase here at the podcast, where
Yeah.
that came from?
Yes. Yeah. So the make good choices little tagline is something that I have said to my cats every day that when I leave the house is I say goodbye and make good choices. And I don't know why I started doing that, but it's been kind of like my go-to thing when I leave the house. And I see it in this context as an acknowledgement that cannabis is not for everyone, and using like finding the right dose for you is kind of a tricky process, but make good choices. Like don't do something that makes you feel unsafe. So really just trying to enjoy weed and kind of from a harm reduction standpoint.
Nice. Yeah, we might have some merch coming up at some point with the little tagline.
Oh, that'd be so awesome. Yes.
All right, what is your favorite cannabis slang term?
I typically call it weed, but my favorite like term is blaze. I just love to it's like, hey, yo, you want to blaze? I don't know. I really like that phrase.
I like that one. I recently heard jazz cabbage, and that's really stuck with me. All right, what is your favorite way of consuming cannabis just if you are to relax? Do it, spend time with yourself or your friends? What's your favorite way?
I like to smoke weed out of a bowl. And so that means like you have like weed like inside of this vessel, whatever. And I like that because it's self-titrating. And so I can just take like one hit and then put it down for a little bit if I, don't want to have any more. Versus I feel like I get just anxious smoking joints because I'm like, I have to finish it. Like I'm wasting it. I'm wasting it if I'm not finishing it right away. So I get like in my head about smoking joints. That's a thing that I want to learn this summer, is to learn how to roll joints because I've never really gotten good at that. So I want to learn how to roll joints. But yeah, typically I'll smoke. Sometimes I'll take like an edible if it's a day where I'm just like, going to go for like a long walk, or like I'm going to go to the beach and go for a walk at the beach, or something that's like a little bit more long lasting, but I'm not going to like hang out around my house and take an edible.
Yeah. Kind of like a waste of a product.
I know, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny because I love smoking joints. I love like the process of rolling joints is really fun for me. Like I've always done that for years. That's been like my favorite way.
Is that the prog in you?
I think it comes from, this is like when I was in Prague, I was pretty broke, like as we all were. And like in Europe, people just smoke spliffs, And so I would smoke a lot of spliffs, which obviously I'm not like proud of, but like it was a way to like save
your
weed. And I guess that was my tobacco phase.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would roll I don't know. It was just like, I think one of my best friends from Prague is from Egypt, and her voice is in the mashup. And it was always just like, all right, let's roll a joint. Like pass the joint. And it was just, I like the ceremony, I guess, of rolling a joint.
Totally. Man, all right, cool. Well, maybe you can.
Yeah, I could totally teach you. I love doing it. I've taught a lot of people. And yeah, now I like get really into it. Like for friends, I put like chamomile tea and joints, and like you can get really creative with it.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so the first spliff I ever had in my life was when I was studying abroad in Australia.
Oh my God, yeah.
Yeah, and I was hanging out with a bunch of Irish guys at the time. And they passed me what I thought like was a joint, and I took a hit. And I was just like, what the fuck did you just give me? Like, this was not just weed. And they're like, yeah, of course it's not just weed. It's a spliff. Like there's tobacco in there. And I was like, wait, what? You put what in that? And they were like, wait, what? You just have just weed in your joints? I was like, huh, what an interesting little moment for all of us here.
Yeah, all of my like classmates who are all European or like African would always be like, "Oh, the American with like so bougie, like whole all this weed." But yeah, I still roll spliffs sometimes just because
Really?
that's what we did for years.
Wow, that's so funny.
That's really funny. Yeah, that's all right. Well, that's kind of all the questions I have for you. Is there anything else you'd like to, anything about you or about weed or about the podcast or us or any questions for me? Any last thing you want to end with?
I'll say like the last thing for me is that the reason why I wanted to make this podcast is because research has an interesting way, or like the scientific process has a great way of insulating research into only academic journals. And like, so a handful of people are like super into, a certain type of research, but I think it's more valuable to bring research to the people. And so that's what I wanted to do, is make the research that I know of as more accessible to the public. And to also kind of like work on destigmatizing cannabis use. And then, so yeah, that's kind of the goal here. But my question for you is that when I first reached out to you and said I wanted to start a podcast about cannabis and exercise, what did you think of that?
Oh man, that's really funny. I actually will say that I wasn't that surprised because when I put out my first podcast, which was my graduation thesis, you were really encouraging. Yeah. And I think you like messaged me and were like, this is really good. And that like felt really good to hear, especially because, we're both, I would say, like on the liberal spectrum of our family. And like, we've always been not physically close or emotionally close, but I think on the same wavelength with things. Yeah. So it was just really like nice to have like a familial support and like kind of get what I was doing. So I was really excited. And also you're so knowledgeable. I think everybody on the podcast can tell how much knowledge you have. So it was like easy to get on board and not just like you were like, this could be cool. We'll see. It was like there was an actual goal, which is I'm a very like my field is like creative. And I think it's great when creativity can like have a really grounding base to work from. Totally. So I mean, science and creativity, I think, need to be more meshed together.
For sure. And it's interesting when I listened to the podcast that you made, it was about comedy. And I was like, oh my, I went through a very major comedy phase when I lived in Bloomington, which surprisingly has a really awesome comedy scene. So thank you for the Comedy Attic in Bloomington, Indiana. I love you. But it was fun to see like, oh my gosh, we are related, these like little things that you would say, or like the ways that you would describe things, or telling a story about Boompa or whatever. And it was like,
I did.
So related. And so I saw this connection and I was like, oh my gosh, she's awesome in that way. And it was fun to reconnect with you over that. And then, with that match of creativity and like the grounding kind of element, we both have both of those, because like I can just like hang out in ideas all day long. And sometimes you are really good at being like, okay, so in this next episode, what I really actually need you to do in the next time you record this is to try this. I was like, oh yeah, okay. And so like you've been really grounding for me in some really important ways as well. And so we've been able to kind of balance that.
It's cool to work together. Our family does not lack in strong personalities at all. I would say. So it's really fun that we can make something together.
Totally. I absolutely agree.
Awesome. Well, here we go with a little bit more info about Whitney.
Yeah.
Looking forward to more things in the future.
All the things.
Thank you so much for listening. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already so you don't miss an episode. And be a gem and leave a rating and review. I might read your reviews on a future episode, so have fun with it. If you'd like to be a guest, have any guest ideas, or have any questions about cannabis and exercise you'd like me to talk about on a later episode, send me a DM on Instagram at Exploring Cannabis and Exercise, or email me at cannabisandexercise@gmail.com. If you would like to become a sponsor, I would love to have ads from listeners of the show with shared values. So even if you're out there doing something not cannabis related, if you're out there making boutique lava lamps or something like that, hell yeah, I'm happy to get the word out about your products. I'm always down to talk about cannabis and exercise for a variety of audiences, so reach out if you want me to come talk to your organization or to your team. Or if you just want to be a good person and throw some money my way, you can Venmo me at Whitney-Ogle. Huge thank you to my cousin, Haley Montowski, who helped me get this podcast off the ground and created that great intro music mashup you hear at the beginning of the episode. The music you hear throughout is called Bonfire Cauliflower, created by Isaac Joel. Make good choices out there and have a good one.